Hello and welcome back to Reach, a GABC Students podcast. My name is Max and I'm the youth pastor here at Golden Acres Baptist Church. And today I have one of our students here with me, Mimi Johnson. And we're going to be talking about how to stay close with God because, we have those spiritual highs and lows, but how do we take those moments to the day-to-day life and just begin to stay close with God and put Him first in everything we do? So check out this episode to hear from Mimi on how we stay close to God. Mimi, entering senior year could be some excitement, some nerves. Which one's weighing out more right now? Right now, you've been in school like a week and a half.
I'm more excited.
Okay, good. And so, talk a little bit about where you're at right now. Right, I want to give you a moment to just share about what your walk with Christ has been like, what that journey's looked like for you. And so, the way we kind of do this is what your life looked like before Jesus, when you decided to trust in Him, and what He's done in your life since then.
Well, I've grown up in the church kind of my whole life, with my dad working at the church, and I've had a really loving family, and I've just been blessed with that, and a lot of people that have really supported me, and just kind of like modeled what it looked like to live for Christ. So I was saved when I was 7, and
Yeah.
I fully believed that I knew what I was doing then.
Yeah.
I was saved when I was 7, but I kind of knew, I guess, bare minimum. So since then, I've like grown a lot and learned really what it looks like to have my own personal relationship with Him,
Yeah.
and not just like my parents, they
Right.
whatever. So
Kind of moving from that head knowledge to more heart knowledge
yes.
of, yeah.
Mhm.
That's good. And so, what has He done in your life since then? Like, obviously, when you were 7, there wasn't like a drastic change in your life because you had all this rampant sin at 7. But how have you kind of grown in that? Like, what has God been doing in your life since then, or even just recently?
Well, for me, I've kind of struggled with a lot of like worry. I stress a lot, and I have not a lot of self confidence. So I've like kind of had to learn to really put my faith in God and realize that I'm His, and that everything I do should be for Him, and that if I'm doing that, then I don't have to worry about my like what I'm doing wrong as much, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. And I can have my confidence in Him, and my
Right.
identity is in Him,
Yeah.
so I'm not as worried about like what I'm
Right.
doing and self-conscious
Yeah.
all the time.
It's not about what we can do anymore, right? It
Yeah.
becomes about what Jesus has already done for us, right? And we talked about that a lot on Sunday mornings and Wednesday nights. And so I want to give you the chance to kind of talk about why you picked this topic. Because when I brought it up in our leadership team meeting, I listed off a whole bunch of topics. And sometimes some people picked some because they were really comfortable maybe talking about that topic, or because it really related to them and kind of tied into their story. And so talk a little bit about why you picked this topic.
Well, I wanted to pick it just because I know a lot of people my age have talked about how they don't really feel as close to God, or they look at other people as like these like super Christians,
Right.
and they feel like they can't have that in a way, and they feel like they have to be perfect to have that. And so I just kind of wanted to talk about like everybody can have that relationship with God no matter where you're at right now. Like I've had a lot of people kind of talk to me about how they think that the church is just way too many rules and things like that, and that they'll worry about things later. So they just drift away from God right
Yeah.
now, and they're not worried about it right now. So I think a lot of people just lose the value in having a relationship with God, and they start thinking about just like going to church and being a good person.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I think that's so common, right? That
Mhm.
people, especially high schoolers, middle schoolers, kind of view church as just a Sunday morning or a Wednesday night kind of thing. And, you know, this is something so much bigger than that, right? Jesus is so much bigger than a 1-2 day a week service, right? Like, and so that's something I'm really passionate about. Like almost every message on a Wednesday night, like we talk about like being the church, right? That this is not just somewhere we come to, but something we're supposed to be living out day to day to really stay close to God, because that's how great our God is and the level of worship that He deserves.
And I feel like I like can really relate to that because growing up in church, it's there's been a lot of times where it's just become a habit for me.
Yeah.
So that's really what I wanted to talk
Because I mean,
about.
you really don't have a choice of coming to church
Yeah.
or not when your dad's the pastor.
Yep.
Yeah. And so staying close to God, right? And again, growing up in church, I'm sure you've had your fair share of youth services, more than you can count. Camp high moments, right? Where you come back from camp just on fire, and then like real life kind of hits you in the face, right? And you can lose those. And so even when you've had those great, super close moments where you just feel God's presence, like those are great. And we want to just sit in those for as long as we can and just get as much of Him in those moments as we can. But we've got to find a way to seek God and feel Him in the day-to-days, right? Feeling His presence, knowing that He's with us, not just when we're at camp, not just when we're at church, but that's really how we begin to stay close, is those day-to-day moments with Him, because that's His design for us, right? Is to do life with us. Like He hasn't called us to just be members of a church or, believers that just kind of give Him their spare time. Like I heard it said one time that God doesn't want to be a part of your life. Like He wants to be your life. Like He doesn't want to just be an add-on. Like that's why it takes like full surrender, right? And so we're called to really function with other believers as the church, not just go to church, go to camp to feel close to Him. And so to get into our topic, why do you think so many people, especially high school, middle schoolers, stray away from God? Like, why do they grow complacent? Why do they drift from God? What would you say the causes of that would be?
I think there's most people my age focus more on religion than the relationship aspect of
Yeah.
living with God. So I think that people just worry so much, like I said, about the rules and about going to church and putting on that kind of act that they don't really look at anything else after.
Yeah.
And I mean, why would you? If you think about it, like God's a loving God, then
Yeah.
even if you mess up, you can just pray and
Right.
He'll forgive you
Yeah.
later.
If God's going to forgive me, why? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people just think that. And I've heard a lot of people talk. Like, I had a girl one time come up to me at school a couple years ago, and she would like ask me if I was a Christian, and I said yes. And then she was like, "Oh, well, I don't really like Christians." And I was kind of like, "Oh, okay." Like it was kind
Yeah.
of awkward at the moment. And then she went on to explain that like she had so much church hurt, and
Yeah.
like a lot of people just hated on her, and that she just felt like she couldn't be accepted in church
Yeah.
because of her sin. And she admitted like she thought what she was doing was wrong, but she just felt like she couldn't be accepted because there was so much hate for
Yeah.
that she just had so much church hurt she didn't even try anymore to go to
Yeah.
church. And that's when I think people have tried religion and not
Yeah.
actually tried to have a relationship with Jesus, because there's gonna be like the church is not a perfect place. The church is
Yeah.
for broken people, and it says
Exactly.
that in the Bible.
Yeah.
So I think if you look at the church and like think that they're gonna be perfect and stuff like that, then that's where you're wrong, because everybody there is gonna be hurt and broken, and we're gonna mess up.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. No, I think you hit that perfectly, because I was already thinking about adding that on, but then you nailed it perfectly. That so many people do have this church hurt, and it turns them off to God. But the reality is, it's not God hurt, right? God's not the one that rejected these people. It's the fact that the church is full of broken people, just like you said. And so there's no perfect church, and so church hurt is very real. I get that, but at the same time, we've got to understand that we're not rejecting God. We're rejecting this kind of false view of Him, right? That God is the one that did this to me because it happened in the church. But the reality is, God's not bound to this building, right? That's not who God is. That's not the way He operates. Um, and so, something you kind of touched on at the beginning where you mentioned, like, if I know God's going to forgive me, like He's loving, all these things, why not kind of drift away and do my own thing after I've prayed that prayer, checked that box, like that kind of thing. And so I think it's important that we note that like that moment of salvation is really not the end. Like, yes, we believe that we're saved by grace through faith, right? That's that Ephesians 2 verse, I believe it's 8 through 10. And so we do believe that like we're saved through faith by God's grace, and He removes our sin. And in that moment, like our name is written down, our seat in heaven is secure. But we also believe that that's not the end, right? That we're saved for something, which it says in that same passage is good works, right? And so it's important to kind of clarify anytime you mention good works, though, that like good works don't add to our salvation. They don't contribute anything to that process, right? Because we're not earning our way into heaven. We're not earning our salvation. Like that is solely by grace and faith alone. But once we're saved, he calls us to do good works, right? As an act of worship, right? Through our obedience, like to walk this life with him.
I think that's kind of another issue is like when you are saved, it requires a response and a change in your life.
Yeah.
And a lot of people just aren't willing to make that change.
Yeah.
So they'll say they're saved, and maybe they actually are, but they're not willing to take any further steps.
Yeah. And it's not our place to ever say you're saved, you're not.
Exactly.
Like that's not up to us, like to judge. That's fully on God. But his word does say, you will know a tree by the fruit that it bears, right? You'll know my people by the way that they live, by the way they conduct themselves. And so it is important that we are living this life, right? Because like you mentioned, the story of that girl that come up to you and said, "Are you a Christian?" She wasn't just taking a poll of everyone she passed by. Like there's clearly something about you, the way you were living, things you were doing, things you weren't doing, that made her think she's probably a Christian, right? And so not that we ever do these things for people's approval, but this is our response to that salvation. It's an act of worship. And so it kind of draws me back to Matthew 13, which is the parable of the sower, right? Which if you grow up in church, you hear this one all the time, but to kind of give the short version of it, right? There's a farmer who goes out and sows seed, and one place it lands is on the rocky path, and it's devoured by birds because there's no soil. It's just a road. And so it's eaten by birds. The next seed lands on rocky ground, and there's not much soil, and so it springs up quickly, but it withers because it really has no roots. Next seed lands among thorns, and it grows, but it gets choked out by these thorns, by these weeds that kind of take everything from it. And then lastly, it falls on good soil, and it produces grain, and it multiplies, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. But then Jesus goes on to explain this because the disciples heard it, and they're like, "Dude, you got to explain this to us. Like, we don't get it." And so he breaks it down further and says, the seed that falls on the path, they hear the word, but they don't understand it. And so it never even grows. It never takes root. It's in one ear, out the other. They don't get it. The seed that falls on the rocky ground, they hear the word and they receive it, right? They have a moment, but they never really have roots. And so when trouble comes, when hardships come, they fall away, right? Because there was no root system in place. The seed that falls among the thorns, right? They grow, but then worldly things, deceitfulness, riches, all these things that culture promises us come and kind of choke out the word and end up kind of squashing that growth. And then lastly, the good soil that the seed falls on bears fruit, multiplies, and grows. And so I think a reason so many people, especially high schoolers, don't stay close is because they're in one of those first three categories, right? Either they hear it and it all just sounds like craziness. Like the only Bible they know is like the King James version with all these these and thous, and it just seems too hard to understand, all these rules like you mentioned, and so they kind of just brush it off. Or either they hear it and it sounds good and they accept it, but they never get plugged in. They never really take that next step of building up that root system, that support group to really keep them going in that right track. Like you have a camp high, but then you come home, life hits you, and you kind of forget all about it. And then the thorns, people want to believe, want to follow Christ, but the things of this world are just too tempting, too overwhelming, and they kind of just lose their faith, drift away, and kind of just get distracted by these worldly things. And so that's why I think it's so important that we focus on making that choice daily, because there's so many things out there that can cause us to drift, right? We talked about a couple Wednesdays ago about the current of culture, right? And how it's constantly pulling us towards things of this world. And so, Mimi, why do we focus so much on walking daily with God? Like, why should we care so much about making it a part of our everyday life?
I've heard a lot that you need Jesus not just because you might die tomorrow, but because you might live tomorrow.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of like sums it all up.
Yeah.
Because like obviously the bigger picture is eternal life in heaven with him. Like he wants us to have that relationship with him, but why get saved now and then spend this whole life just kind of like wasting it and
Yeah.
not pointing other people to that too. Like if you have something you're excited about or you're passionate about, you would want to share that. So you would want to share this too, right?
Yeah.
And I think people hear that a lot, but you really just have to like decide in your heart and like decide for yourself that you really want to live like that. Otherwise, they're not going to change.
Yeah. And it goes back to what we said, right? That we're
Mhm.
saved for good works, not by, but for. And so we
Yeah.
can be saved, like you said, in coast. Like hypothetically speaking, I would question, how real that faith is to you. But again,
Right.
that's not up to me. And so,
Yeah.
but there we know from Scripture there will be people in heaven who never shared the gospel, never went to church, right? You think about the thief on the cross, right? Who literally, like in his dying moments, like says, Jesus, remember me in paradise today, and he says, all these things happen. And so we know like he'll be there. And one day we'll get to talk to him and be like, dude, you made it. Like, how awesome is that? But then we also know the Great Commission in Matthew 28 says, go and make disciples of all nations, right? It calls us to action, right? To not just be saved and coast and do what we want after that, but to really begin living out our faith. So the idea that we've been saved, so now we can go and share that with others is a big part. Like you said, our salvation is really just our ticket to participate in this whole, plan that God is working out, right? His ultimate will for us, for this world, like to really go and be his mouthpiece, to be the hands and feet of Christ. Because, we also see in scripture in Matthew 5, where we're supposed to be salt and light, right? To go and be a light in a dark world, to be salt and like bring something real, add flavor, preserve, the people of earth. And so, yes, staying close to God benefits me in my walk and in my growth, and it keeps me on the right track. But it's also for others to see it, right? Not to try to earn their approval or boast about how good we are, but to give us opportunities to share, right? Like when that girl comes up and asks you if you're a Christian, like that's an opportunity, right? And even if she is someone that wanted nothing to do with Christianity or with God because of whatever reason, she still had that encounter that day. And like she now knows you are a Christian, and by the way you treat her and show her a different side that maybe she hadn't seen before, that you care for her and love her and don't count her out, it creates that doorway, that opportunity to enter into a bigger conversation. And so to kind of tie this back together, if we want to get close to God, we want to get better about spending time with him, it can't just be once a week at church, right? It can't. Like, for you in basketball, right? Because we know you're a basketball star, senior season coming up. um, let's say you show up to practice once a week. How's that going to go for you when the season starts?
Not good. I'm not
Not
going to know anything.
Yeah, not good. You're not going to know anything. You're not going to know the plays, which we don't want that to happen. Coming in midway through last season,
I already know about that.
yeah, yeah. Um, but you're also not going to be very good. Like
Yeah.
you're really good now, but if you only practice once a week from here on out, like it's not going to stick with you. Like it's not something you can stop doing and stay good at it, right? And so it's a daily kind of practice, right? And you've modeled that through basketball, like the way you've practiced like every day, going to the gym, shooting in the gym up at church when you can't go to school, like really using those opportunities though to leverage the gospel. Because like when season does come and you're maybe ahead of some of these other girls that haven't put that work in, that's another opportunity to be like, yeah, it's just important to make this an everyday thing, like just like I would with my faith. And like it opens up these conversations. um, and so it's the same with our walk with God, right? If we only talk to him when we're at church, we only experience his presence when we're at church, we're not going to really know him. Like we're not going to know the plays if we don't go to practice. And we can't expect that where I'm at with God now is going to stay there if I stop putting in the effort, right? It's just like any relationship. If
You talked about I don't know how long ago it was, but you talked about it on a Wednesday night. Like being a Christian, you can't just walk with God when it's comfortable or convenient.
Yeah.
And you were talking about that, like you can't just do it. Like if I just went to practice when I wanted to, when it was
Yeah.
comfortable for me, then like I
Right.
wouldn't be getting better because I wouldn't want to go a lot.
Yeah.
So same thing,
Right.
walking with God, you got to do it like even when it's rough
Yeah.
sometimes.
It can't be tied to our emotions, right?
Right.
It can't be tied to how I feel. I feel like practicing, so I'm going to go do it.
Yeah.
No, you want to get better, you got to go when you don't feel like it. I'm going to choose to worship even when I don't feel like it. I've had a crappy day. I don't really feel like putting my arms up. We did shoulders today, like exercise. Like, I'm not really feeling like it, but this is the God of the universe. And I'm choosing to worship him because I know when I do, things change. And
Right.
so it's making those choices, right? And so we know we should stay close to God, but sometimes that's easier said than done. And so what does that look like? Like, what does that kind of look like for you? And so what does spending that daily time with God actually look like?
Well, for me, I've noticed that there's been a lot of little changes as much, things that I didn't notice at first, but
Mm-hmm.
now, like looking back, like I've noticed, like before, how when I was just kind of like a complacent Christian, like things have changed from then till now, even, and I'm still working on things. I'm not perfect at all, but like for me, I drive a lot.
Yeah.
I drive everybody
Yeah.
everywhere, and when I'm in my car alone, that's kind of my time where I just play worship music or just pray,
Yeah.
and that's kind of my like alone time with God. So even that, like before, I would not have done that. I wouldn't have thought of that. But now, like I've enjoyed that time,
Yeah.
and it's just my own time, and I
Yeah.
get it pretty much every day. So
Right. Finding those moments to just devote to God, like no matter what kind of day you've had, if I'm in the car, this is going to be my time with God. Like, even if there's other people in there with you,
yeah,
like saying like, this is what we're going to listen to, or this is what is okay to talk about in my car, and this is what isn't. Like, if you want me to drive you, these are kind of the rules. Or if you want me to take you anywhere on a Wednesday, you're also coming to church with me. Kind of, that kind of thing. Um, and so, what are some ways that you would say you can stay close to God no matter what's going on? Like, finding those set times, but what are some other things that have kind of helped you do that? Like some practical ways. Like, I think the one you mentioned was great. Is there anything else that's really worked for you?
I think having a prayer time too is really important
Yeah.
because if you're and it can't just be you always talking in the morning. Like you can't use God as a crutch. You can't
Yeah.
just um, always pray to Him and just ask Him for what you want,
Right.
because then you're not gonna ever. If you're not listening, you're not gonna ever hear a response.
Right.
And like people talk about all the time, they're like, "Oh, well, I just don't know what God wants from me. I don't know what He's saying. He's not talking or whatever." But He probably is. He's probably trying to show
Right.
you. You're just not listening. And
Right.
I've learned that because there's been multiple times where I haven't been
Yeah.
listening. So
Yeah. I think.
adding a prayer time, and even if it's like a scheduled prayer time,
Yeah.
at first it might seem like you're kind of forcing yourself to pray, but then over time you're
Right.
just gonna have a desire to.
Right. Because you see the benefits of that time.
Mm.
Right. And something that I know just from knowing you and kind of getting to know you from this last year since you moved here, like you talked about your dad being the senior pastor here. And so coming up on a year now since y'all moved here and joined our group, moved from Panama City. Um, how did you make friends when you first moved here? Right? Because you didn't know anyone.
No.
You had some family kind of close, but they weren't going to be in your schools. Like, how did you make friends?
It was kind of hard, but I think it depended on the setting. But at church, I tried to be more open with people, and I should have done that more at school too, but
Yeah.
I didn't. Because I did act different in different settings, and I try to work on it, but I wasn't doing that at the time. So
Yeah.
just trying to like be open and like kind of stay true to who I am
Yeah.
and not give in to other things, like
Right.
just to show who I am to people and try not to fake it.
Yeah.
So
And then to really start building those relationships,
yeah,
right? Like,
then,
it takes, putting yourself out there and talking to them, right?
right,
You got to be who you are. Like, you can't fake it. Like, if you want to build genuine friendships, like not just surface level, like people I can sit with at lunch and feel safe, like people that I really want to grow with, we've got to talk. We've got to get to know them. And it's the same with God, right? If we want to build a relationship with Him, we've got to study His Word. We've got to get to know Him through His Word. We've got to spend time with Him in prayer, like you mentioned. Like, we've got to talk to Him. It's the same way, but we overcomplicate this so much. Like you've said, like, religion gets so complicated with rules and all these things, but truly it comes down to just being a relationship. Like it doesn't have to be all these different things. Like it's all about love. Like Jesus made it all about love and about communication, right? And James 4:8 says, draw near to me and I will draw near to you, right? Like that's God's promise. And so it really has to be a daily choice, right? Like we said, can't be about our feelings, our emotions, because those are going to change. Our feelings, though, don't change God's promises. We can always go to Him. And so the same way you grow closer to your friends is the same way you grow closer to God, really. And so, Mimi, do you have any final thoughts or kind of additional advice for people wanting to get close and stay close to God?
I would say the main thing is just try to find a group that will help you grow close to God. Because if you're around people that aren't going to help you, um, not that you can't be around them ever, because you
Yeah.
need to be around other people, but um, find a group that you can really rely on, or at least one person that you can really rely
Yeah.
on that will keep you closer to God.
Yeah,
So,
for sure. Well, thanks for being on, Mimi. You did a great job. I know you're a little nervous, but you did great. And so we hope you enjoyed this episode. Hope it's been of help to you. If it has, share it with someone because the title of this podcast is Reach, because that's truly what we want to do. We want to reach those around us with this message of hope that's found in the gospel. And so thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.